You're tuned to 1520 WCAT Radio, and it's time now for the Avid Reader Show with your host, Sam Hankin. Sam will offer reviews and interviews of some of the more interesting books and authors of today, and now Sam Hankin.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop, one of the very few remaining independent bookstores in this area and happily owned by me. Today, we're really lucky to have with us Dr. Stephen Greenblatt, author of The Swerve, How the World Became Modern. It's the winner of the 2011 National Book Award and the 2012 Pulitzer Prize for Nonfiction. Dr. Greenblatt, in addition to his many publications, was previously best known for his book Will and the World, a biography of Shakespeare that remained on the New York Times bestseller list for weeks. This book is about a poet who lived 2,000 years ago named Lucretias, who wrote this epic poem on the nature of things. Dr. Greenblatt's proposition in this book, and explored in a delightful way, is how that book may have moved our world into modernity. Thanks, Stephen, for joining us today on the Avid Reader.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Sam.
I guess the first question is, how in the world can one poem change our world? How can it create a swerve from one path to another?
Well, in some obvious way, the answer is it can't. Nothing ever happens in, even with the grandest and most important things that can be said and done, nothing ever happens as directly as that once and for all. Though we tend to identify certain works, the Book of Genesis, the Gospels, the Epistles of Paul, the Communist Manifesto, whatever, as having extraordinary power. But even those books always have power that is distributed in complicated ways through lots of channels and in indirect ways. And that's also probably true of the other historical events in the world that turn the world in a direction. Nonetheless, the world does turn, and it happens for reasons, and if it's not one single thing doing it all, each thing that happens, a significant thing that happens, makes a real impact. And this was one of those texts, but it happens to be one that we haven't given enough thought to, or at least that was my claim, that really did make a huge difference, even though it was a difference, as I say, that is not, you go to sleep one day in 1417, you wake up the next day and the world has totally changed. Of course, it doesn't work that way.
How lucky are we to actually even have this poem to talk about?
Yes, hugely lucky. It was a very strange thing to have survived. First of all, because so little survived from the ancient world. Things that were written 2,000 years ago and longer had a way of going away. Things decay, the world changes, and it's remarkable that this text managed through all the gigantic disruptions that occurred in the world, in the political and social, cultural life of the world. This poem happened to survive. It didn't survive easily. It disappeared for a very, very long time, and virtually all the works around it, all the works that it represented in its school of thought, disappeared. But this one, amazingly enough, was swept up onto a beach, as it were, and survived.
Well, it's really interesting. There's this gentleman, a monk named Poggio. That is it pronounced Poggio?
Yes, but no, he wasn't a monk. He wasn't. Poggio Bracciolini was never took religious orders of any kind. A secular.
Oh, that's right. He
fellow,
worked,
just like you and me.
But he worked for the papacy. He worked
for the papacy all his life, or most of his life. 50 years, he worked as a bureaucrat in the Vatican.
Well, before we go on to how he found this manuscript. Did you kind of fancy yourself as a modern-day Poggio when you found the poem in the bargain bin at Yale at the co-op?
I certainly didn't fancy myself at that time as anything of the sort. I didn't. I was. It's true, hunting for books, but just for something to read over the summer. And I didn't think of my encounters, and I don't, for that matter, now think of them as so important or momentous that I would make any such claim. But it's true at the same time. And you're right, Sam, that in writing the book, one of the reasons I begin with my own experience of finding the book is to convey that book hunting, as Poggio was the greatest book hunter of his age, is not only a matter of that distant story, but is what we do when we find a book ourselves and discover that it's speaking to us.
Well, that's kind of the reason why it's difficult owning an independent bookshop now, as you probably well know. But one of the serendipities about owning a store like that or being a patron is that when you're looking for one particular book on a shelf, you also happen to see the book to the left of it and to the right of it.
Yes, you're absolutely right. One of the remarkable things, I'm a huge fan of and supporter of and beneficiary of independent bookstores. But one of the things that independent bookstores give you is precisely that accidental, serendipitous encounter with things you weren't looking for, didn't expect to find.
Right, and actually sometimes, or many times in my case, create a swerve in your own space-time continuum.
Yes, it's true.
So, if indeed, Lucretias' poem, posits things that were really scary back then, and people didn't want to believe, and were later considered blasphemous. That the world is created without the intervention of gods. That matter is essentially divisible to atoms. That sex occurs, and in some sense,
everyone knew sex occurred, and everyone knew matter was in some sense divisible, because you only have to chop an onion to realize that. Nonetheless, the consequences of actually thinking through all of this were quite disturbing.
Well, because of the nature in which the nature of things is written, how is the idea of almost kind of like pure chance or swerves, how is it any different than today's theories of chaos theory, or the idea that a butterfly flapping its wings in the sub-Sahara creates a hurricane that later devastates the southeastern United States?
I do think that there is a relationship. First of all, I think that it is the case that the recovery of Lucretius's text, to go back to your first question, is something like a version of the butterfly effect, though less entirely random perhaps than that, because there are strange links, and the person who found the book, in this case Poggio, at least had the name of the book he was looking for in his head, along with a lot of other names when he went there. Nonetheless, the theory itself basically says that there is no large-scale design. There are lots of local designs, astonishing things, astonishingly beautiful, complex things, like the eye of a common housefly, which is fabulously complex and beautiful as a design. But there's no grand scheme that everything is following, and no one who's created and making these things. So that one of the most peculiar and difficult ideas in Poggio, in Lucretius, in the text that Poggio found, is that the eyes that we have, or anyone has, don't come into existence because someone has thought, it would be nice to have sight, and creates an eye. It doesn't work that way. What happens is that there are mutations, strange conjunctions, banging together of atoms in different ways over enormous periods of time. And if it actually something comes about that turns out to be useful in terms of survival skill, then it might or might not, but it might be reinforced and reinforced and reinforced, and eventually develop into something that actually takes ultimately the form that we have it. But it's not because someone's designed it.
All right, well, let me ask you this then. What you just said is extremely interesting. It's the way I feel as well. Does it spring full-blown from your brain, or do you actually think these thoughts might have or probably did go through Lucretius's head when he's writing the poem?
Which thoughts, sorry?
The thoughts that the world is essentially chance, that, like Richard Feynman posited, the multiverse, that we have all the space and time in the world, so obviously everything can happen, did happen, will happen.
No, he says this explicitly. These aren't my thoughts. These are his thoughts. That is, say, this was and not just his alone. This was formulated. These thoughts were formulated essentially. I mean, often not in the identical terms, but essentially in the core of what you're saying. These were formulated in the 4th century in Greece by Democritus and Leucippus, and then developed by Epicurus, and then taken over by Lucretias and by others who were followers of this Greek line of thought. And it happens that very little of the Greek origins survive, and that's for partly accidental reasons. As I said, things just appear, and partly for reasons that you already alluded to, which is that a lot of people felt they didn't have a horse in that particular race. The pagan priests didn't like it, the Jewish rabbis didn't like it, and the Christian priests didn't like it because it denied the existence of a maker, someone to whom you could pray for rewards.
Well, if you take Lucretius and then move Lucretius's the discovery of his work to the beginning of the Renaissance, it's always seemed to me a shame that we call the Dark Ages the Dark Ages, because it gives you this image which is not what it was. Don't you think that there were thinkers during that time that we might not or don't know about that held those same views, and just we don't know who they were or what they said?
Well, those same might be a little bit on the might be a little bit of an exaggeration. There's always variations in something new in the world. Nonetheless, I take the force of what you say, and I think there's some truth to it. That first of all, at the level of atoms, it's absolutely the case that people knew. It wasn't the most popular view in the world in the Middle Ages, but people knew that the world broke down into smaller bits, and they had to break down into something. And they knew that they knew from the same way we would know from, let's say, looking at an insect, a tiny insect, that even tiny insects seem to have smaller parts and smaller parts, so till eventually you lose sight of what they are because your eye isn't capable of seeing them. So that idea for thoughtful people in the Middle Ages wasn't so strange. And there's actually interesting work that's done on medieval thinkers who grasped that. What follows from that is very tricky. Was there someone in the Middle Ages who said to himself or herself, I think what follows from that is that the world wasn't created by any intelligent maker, by a God. I think that the world is the product of the random banging of these atoms together over an infinite period of time. I think that there are no punishments and rewards in the afterlife because the soul dies with the body. I think that the world was made, or that the only value in the world is the enhancement of pleasure and the reduction of pain, because the world wasn't made for human beings, because it's a huge universe with many planets and many stars, and we're only one tiny piece of it, and so forth and so on. Was there someone who said such a thing? Possible. I mean, but it would have been discouraged, to put it mildly, and not just discouraged by the authorities, who would, of course, have not looked kindly on anyone who had such a succession of thoughts. In fact, would have killed them. But it also would have been discouraged internally. It takes certain conditions to think certain things. So it would have been very, very difficult for a very long period of time, let's say from the 5th or 6th century of the Christian era until this work returned to the world in the 15th century, for people to think this conjoined set of thoughts. And then when they came back in 1417, when Poggio found the ancient poem, even then they certainly weren't acceptable or even comprehensible, because it seemed so weird, these notions.
Do you, as you articulated the universe just now, is that what you believe?
Well, effectively, yes.
Me too.
I mean, do I think that that we're the most important thing, that the world, that the universe was created for humans, that our destiny is the most important thing, that there is someone watching over our fates and determining whether we'll be rewarded or punished in another world? No, I don't think any such thing. So I guess I do believe this, and I did already back in the 1960s when I first encountered this remarkable poem. I did think, my God, this is the world that I live in. But I've just said, my God, so I obviously live in a world that still invokes a deity.
Right. I recall a line from a movie where someone said, "My God," although there isn't one.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, by the way, Sam, that I'm full of contradictory feelings of the sort that human beings have. I'm full of intense gratitude that I'm alive and that that I have a wonderful wife and beautiful children and grandchildren. So, gratitude to whom? Well, I can't really say gratitude toward my maker. I don't believe I have a maker in that form, but the feeling of gratitude is very intense.
Speaking of gratitude, I'm sorry, didn't I?
No, and I was going to say, I mean, we all have these. We all have these feelings, and then Lucretias doesn't want to make the feelings go away. He just doesn't want them to attach the things that he thinks are not good for you to feel, which is that every time the thunder rolls in the sky, there must be a god throwing a lightning bolt down at some malefactor, or when a child dies, it must be because someone's being punished by someone for something. He thinks these are terrible ideas.
Well, it's funny what I was going to ask you. I'm glad you just said this, because I remember the passage in your book where, well, you are in love with it seems like you're in love with the idea of discourse. And when you paint the picture of a patrician Roman's home and the nature of the shelves where the papyrus scrolls were stored and the fact that they had tags on the end of them, it seems like you're so enamored of that idea, as I am too. And then what that does to me is I just wonder, why did the world not continue along that way? Why did we lose so much between then and the Renaissance? And it seems like how much further along we would have been had we been able to continue this concept of discourse, that the person is the person is a text, that kind of thing.
There was a very brief period. It turns out maybe we should put the question the opposite way. There was not why the world didn't continue in that way, but how it ever got that way, because it was actually a fairly brief period of maybe a couple of hundred years in which at least certain significant numbers of people, the people probably who shop at independent bookstores, were able to sit around and ask quite open questions about what this is all about, what it means to exist at all, what the universe is made of, whether it's actually important to support the state in its most in this case the Roman state in its most ambitious enterprises of world domination, whether it would be better to spend more time in your garden cultivating your plants and cultivating your inner life, and so forth and so on. There was a period of time in which it was actually possible for people to have both the leisure and the freedom of mind to do this, and then that period ended.
Yeah, I know. It's when you quote Flaubert and you say, he says, the moment between the death of the gods and the birth of the Christ, when man stands alone. It reminded me of a quote from William O. Douglas, the Supreme Court Justice, and what he said is, as nightfall does not come all at once, neither does oppression. In both instances, there is a twilight when everything remains seemingly unchanged, and it is in such twilight that we all must be most aware of change in the air, however slight, lest we become unwitting victims of the darkness.
Amazing quotation. I didn't know that. Fantastic.
Well, it just seemed apropos because, he's talking about the loss of liberty, which he was a great champion of liberties, but it also seems to be, equates to the transition between this time of wonder and the ability to think, and then all of a sudden it collapses. Yes.
I mean, it probably is the case, as I say, most of us, if we're lucky, won't experience anything as dramatic as a collapse, just as we probably won't experience anything as dramatic as a sudden renaissance. Nonetheless, I've lived long enough to know that we have moments in which suddenly everything's up for grabs, and other moments in which nothing seems to be up for grabs. And likewise, we have intimations that. Now, part of it is just what happens when you get older. You think, it was better then, actually, and we've sort of lost that. We're in danger of losing it. So that at the local level, I mean, when I look around at our political life, and at let's say, in both sides, in the way in which now super PACs are collecting money or for crazy sums for this. You wonder, what is this about? What's the relationship between this and the idea of a democracy? What are we up to? And you feel that something is shifting, even if you can't quite see how it's shifting or where it's going.
I think we're in that moment of Twilight right now. I honestly do. And I think you actually telegraphed it either consciously or subconsciously when you talk about the Romans having this discourse and using the discourse as a shield against the fact that there's civil war and evil fomenting in the world about them. And they use this lovely palace house, summer house, as a shield against the coming of this. And I think you were kind of telling us.
Well, a little bit, but I resist it. I mean, you're probably right. But I resist my own impulse or my own. I don't want to open my own telegram, if that's the way to put it, because for one thing, probably most generations wind up feeling some version of this, and secondly, I have children and grandchildren whom I hope are entering into a world that they'll actually bring to a better place than we're at now, and thirdly, because the Romans that I was writing at around 50 before the Christian era were about to embark on several hundred years that they couldn't have anticipated, that they came out of the other end of the Civil War. It's true that they lost their republic, but they entered into a period of astonishing expansion and prosperity that was based on lots of cruelty and injustice, but nonetheless was for them a good thing. At least for some people who profited from it, and so forth and so on. It's easy to feel. Look, I'm in my 60s. It's easier to feel, it was better in the early 70s, or it was better, God help me, in the 1950s. But what does it mean to feel this way? You have to fight for what you think is important, and you have to hold on to what you think is precious and valuable, and you shore yourself up. And part of my interest in writing the book that I wrote is to say, look, this is what I understand to be our inheritance of as people in a modern world. I don't think that it's a good thing to get into a bunker and dream about a divine force that's actually has an interest in something called the United States of America, or in the Boston Patriots football team, or the way in which I look around at my contemporaries in America, at our own contemporary culture, I can't believe it, because the ideas seem to me so unbelievably crude and primitive.
Well, I agree. But both sides in a football game are praying to the Lord to win. Obviously, there's an issue there.
Yeah, well, it's as if they actually thought that the Lord was following the football.
Well, apparently they do. That's why Rick Santorum got as far as he got.
It seems fantastic to me. So, anyway, at that moment, I want to say, wait a second, and I want to think not just what I believe in, but what I think is a very, very long human adventure, one that goes back, as I say, in this case, 2,500 years, to people trying to think their way out of magical processes of this kind, to think their way toward a more steady, rational apprehension of the nature of the universe.
Well, yeah, but and I'll let it go after this, I promise. But if you look at what happened in Syria last week, and still is happening,
yes,
you can't ignore the fact that we are in a situation which is not at all pleasant in certain ways.
No, well, that's true enough, although, it's horrible, in fact, unspeakable.
It is unspeakable.
I begin by being exceedingly grateful for the pure accident that it means that I don't live in Holmes, but in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But then you can't just settle into that sense of gratitude. You have to think about what you or anyone else should do about it.
Well, look, I'm like you. I'm 60. I have 4 wonderful children. I have a grandchild on the way. I'm like you. It's the alternative of thinking. I won't even discuss thinking the alternative because it is unthinkable.
Yeah.
But bringing you back to, I guess, a less morbid level, and this I would normally think would be personal, and I wouldn't ask you questions like this, but you put it in your book right out front, is your mother's unusual fear of mortality, how that informed your book and actually may have made you write the book. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that?
Yes, I do write about it. I mean, so I can't pull too far back, though there are lots of reasons, of course, one writes a book, but if I tried to think about not even so much why I wrote the book, but why my encounter with Lucretias initially when I was, not fully out of my teens, was so powerful to me. It had to do with my feeling that it spoke to me about the fear of death, not my own fear of death, but the fear of death to which my childhood basically labored, and that was my mother's very deep anxiety about her own mortality. My mother was a wonderful, intelligent, loving, complex person, and she would never have wanted to inflict upon me any such pain, but she managed to inflict quite a bit of it, having to do with her own tremendous anxiety about dying. I mean, which in turn came from long before I was born, the death of a younger sister of hers, who passed away from the consequences of strep throat in the years before penicillin was invented. And I just lived in the shadow of this terrible event all my childhood, and with my mother's very powerful sense that she was not destined to live very long. So
I felt really sorry for you because you had to go through all this over and over again, and then she lived to be 90, which is how old my mother is now.
That was, of course, perfectly happy. I mean, I'm so happy that my mother lived a long life. And actually, though my mother had a bad year and a half before she died, the last year and a half was very difficult. She actually had a very good run of it, strangely haunted by this sense that she was going to go at any moment. And from the time that, looking back on it, from the time that she was actually quite a young woman. So that was, to feel bad is to feel bad for her for laboring under this. But it's true that I took...
it was a burden for you.
It was a burden because, I mean, and as I wrote in the book, only when I had my own children did I fully realize that the level of compulsion that my mother must have felt under, because you don't normally inflict this. And partly it's just generational. I don't, now somehow we're more sensitive to threatening our children, I think, or at least the people I know, including myself, are more wary about saying, "You're going to kill me. I'm going to die from this," and so on and so on. But my parents were quite comfortable saying this.
It's even worse than that, because you were in a situation where you're walking down the street and your mother puts her hand to her carotid artery.
Yes.
And did she make you touch it, actually?
Yeah, she would make me feel it, and
that's pretty bad.
Blood pulsing, poor thing. She had some kind of tachycardia, and it whatever its origins were, whether it was purely sort of the consequences of neurotic anxiety, or it was something else, something more organic. It didn't matter. It scared the bejesus out of her. Yeah. And, of course, it scared the bejesus out of me.
Yeah.
Yes, I loved my mother, as I love the memory of her now, and felt bad for her. I mean, but also was afraid that I'd lose her. But fortunately, I didn't.
Well, it's funny because later on in the book, when you quote Alden, and you say, is the mortal world enough? Is the mortal world enough for you now? Does it, the way your mother was, does that affect your thoughts about?
It is, Sam. I mean, am I completely tranquil and placid about the prospect of dying? No, of course not. I mean, I have the kind of sentient being's fear of illness and death. I mean, and I very much have, in my case, sort of Montaigne's hope that I'll die when I'm planting cabbages in my garden, not worrying about either the garden or the cabbages or anything else, just go. But that said, I actually have very much I don't live in fear. That was really a burden that I'm glad that, whatever happened, and it wasn't just Lucretias's book, but whatever happened to make me free of this terrible thing under which my mother labored, I'm extremely grateful for, because it poisoned a lot of life. That's the trouble with it, and that's what Lucretius says. The trouble is you have a very limited amount of time anyway. To spend it under this terrible burden is a horrible waste.
Well, there's two ways of living. There's always two ways of living. There are always two ways of doing everything. I've always wanted to live my life, if I had to be, sadder but wiser. But by the same token, there's, when ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. And so at some point in the book, you talk about essentially therapies for death.
Yes.
Religion, I think religion is a therapy for death as well. And it would be wonderful if I could have faith.
Yes.
And know that I would go to heaven and sit on a cloud and play a harp. It would be wonderful if I had that faith. It's just that I would lose my wisdom, or whatever wisdom I have.
I mean, it's true that it's hard to will yourself to believe something that seems literally unbelievable. And I long ago ceased to try to do that for myself. But a very, very long time ago, I felt already that this wasn't something I could believe in. But that doesn't mean that I take myself, to be honest with you, lots of pleasure in religion. It's not an accident that when I go to Europe, I spend a huge amount of my time in churches or looking at religious objects, altarpieces, paintings, and so forth and so on. So why is that? That's because human beings have put a huge amount of their creative power and energy into worship. The worship and that the beauty of what they've created, as anyone knows who sets foot in Chartres or San Clemente in Rome or wherever, is overwhelming. So the idea that you'd want to turn away from that seems crazy.
I agree with you. I mean, I'm as guilty, if that's the wrong word, as you. I mean, when I go to New York, every single time, I go to St. Patrick's, I sit there, I listen to Mass, I light a candle for my ex-mother-in-law, my ex-wife's mom. I light a candle. They raise the price from $1 to $2, which I don't like. But yeah, I mean,
I don't feel guilty about it. I don't think. I mean, I absolve you from all guilt. I don't feel guilty about it. What I feel is that there's good Lucretian, basically wisdom about it. Lucretius says, but you don't need Lucretius to tell you this, that there's a difference between if something gives you pleasure, if going to the Temple of Venus, as Lucretius would have imagined it, and with a chaplet of flowers around your head, and doing a dance in the presence of the goddess, if that gives you pleasure, if it touches the part of you that is glad to be alive, that's good. You should do it. You just shouldn't believe that Venus cares or will listen. Lucretius wrote a great anti-religious poem that begins with one of the great religious hymns from the ancient world, a hymn to the goddess Venus. Why does he do that? Because he thinks it carries a huge force, and it does carry huge force, and there's no reason to abjure it. The mistake is to as it were, put your fate into the hands of the experts who will teach you things, try to make you believe things that are actually not good for you to believe. That's what Lucretius thought.
Yeah, it's
and on Friday night, my wife and I light the Sabbath candles, bless our little boy, bless the bread and wine, with great pleasure and without sheepishness or guilt, because it actually makes life more pleasurable to mark one's existence.
Yeah, it's like going to a funeral of a loved one. The loved one doesn't really care if you're at the funeral or not.
Exactly.
But it means a lot for you.
Yes, it's true.
Yeah, and you know what? You just espoused a very Epicurean viewpoint, actually, when you think about it.
Yes. Yes, I think that's true.
When you imagine Poggio's travels, or when you imagine the Roman library that's so really well painted, I mean, I really loved that part of the book. I feel like I'm in those quarters, in those palatial quarters. What do you consider your writing? I could say, okay, is this history? Is it nonfiction? Is it speculation? Is it investigative journalism? What are you creating? It didn't happen the way you say, but what is it?
Well, in the case of the particular account of Poggio going to Fulda in Germany, where he may or may not have found the text, yes, we don't know that that's where it was because he didn't reveal it, or because the letter in which he revealed it is lost. We know that he found it in a monastic library. There's a very good chance, for reasons that I explain, why it might have been Fulda, and if it wasn't Fulda, it was another monastery. And there are things you can say about monasteries in the early 15th century that make the experience apprehensible. We could simply list the available facts and do a little chart of where the rooms were in a monastery and what a scriptorium, what you might have found in a scriptorium in the form of a list. But why would you do such a thing? Because the actual, not just the pleasure, though the pleasure is quite important, but even the intellectual force of the experience is in the sensuous details of that experience.
Agreed, but you win the highest award, the Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction. And when you paint the picture of Poggio coming into town and people not knowing who he is because of the way he dresses, what he's doing, he's not a merchant, he's not a nobleman, those kinds of things, that didn't, well, I love it.
It's speculation. It's true. It's speculation. I mean, it is speculation. It's speculation based on the best amassing of the facts in the case that I could do. But I could easily imagine someone doing it, conjuring up a different picture. And the only thing I would say beyond what I've just said is that we know that that's true for events for which we have a much, much better record than these which took place 600 years ago. For things that took place, I mean, let's say when John F. Kennedy went to Dallas in 1963, there are very different accounts of what it was like on the streets, which is only to say that things aren't available, even for those events that are heavily documented. Things don't simply come pre-digested in objective form. They're objects of interpretation. And I'm in the business of interpretation. Any historian or literary critic is in the business of interpretation. And, of course, you can get it wrong. And then I can assure you someone will tell you you've got it wrong.
Yeah, and some of the reviews of your book have said that.
I mean, and that's fine. I mean, that's good. That's as it should be. I mean, if there's a more powerful and more persuasive account to be given, then it should be given. And if, for example, I have turned out to have grossly underplayed the importance of Neoplatonism, and which I don't give much time to, then someone should write an account in which it becomes clear why that would be very important to do, and so forth. So, I mean, I'm all for it. That's what we do. What historians, literary critics, and so forth do is very far away from what, let's say, a biologist does or a physicist. But it's also the case, as we know, that biologists and physicists are also creating kind of artificial worlds and describing what happens in them, and there's always a possibility that someone will come up with a counter account.
Well, the thing is that some of the reviews that have suggested this is less than, I don't know, like maybe the New York Times review, what would say, okay, it's not as exciting as it could be. I completely differ with that. I feel that those accounts that you portray of actual events occurring, and like I keep going back to the Roman Discourse thing and Poggio's travels, those are the things that make this entire picture world come alive to me, and those are the things I love in books, and you've done it so well. I guess the question I have is, can I trust you?
Yes. Well, I mean, I hope you can. I think you can, but it is the case that you can trust me, I hope, the way you can trust many people in your life whose who claim to know something, do they absolutely know something? Could they get something wrong? Absolutely, they can get something wrong. There's many things I'm sure that I've got wrong here, but I've done the best. I've done the best I can, and if someone comes up with another account, then you'll take that into consideration. I haven't. I think that it's very important. Look, I think it's very important not to check your imagination at the door.
Great.
I think that if it's actually worth something, it has to be a kind of airless world without your senses, without your imagination, without your capacity to conjure up something. That's ridiculous. Why should it be that way? It's not that way to think of great writers. It's not that way in Gibbon. It's not that way in Macaulay. It's not that way in any historian one cares about. And so I've done the best I can with the materials I have, and that includes not checking my imagination at the door, but using it. But I signal very, very clearly in the book when I am speculating and when I'm not. At least I think I do. And it's never the case that I make something up and try to fob it off.
Also, once you write,
what happened?
And once you write the book, the burden of the book is off your shoulders. It's onto the readers, and it's both a burden and a delight. I mean, you have the delight of reading the book, and then you, the reader, have to make the decisions.
It's true, but I think that's true, Sam. But I would take as a fundamental violation of my contract with the reader if I actually tried to fob off.
Oh yeah.
Something that I knew was not true, or that I was simply making up as a piece of fiction. Otherwise, I should be writing a novel. But it's also the case that each of us draws the boundary in a different place, so that a different writer will not allow herself or himself to say something. When I wrote the Shakespeare book, Will in the World, my editor, Elaine Mason at Norton, made a couple of suggestions, one of which was quite revelatory. She said, I tend to use the academic present when I'm writing about Shakespeare, to say that Shakespeare knows that, Shakespeare chooses to investigate this, Shakespeare feels that. And she said, why don't I try it in the past tense? And so I tried it, and in fact, I wrote the book in the past tense as a result of this. But it turns out to be a completely different claim that you're making if you say Shakespeare chose, Shakespeare felt. You're making it, and I had to cut out and throw away a huge amount of stuff that I had written because I felt I couldn't justify saying Shakespeare chose unless I had some corroborating evidence that he chose. It wasn't in the kind of abstract academic present.
And you have the burden of having to do it with two people, Lucretius and Shakespeare, who very little of their lives is known.
Absolutely. I mean, Shakespeare is a kind of miracle of documentation compared with Lucretius.
Yeah, I know. That's very true. But then again, you talk about Lucretius and you do caveat it with regard to lunacy and suicide. And why don't you talk a little bit about that real quick?
Well, yes, and I should go off. In the case of Lucretius, there's virtually no biographical information of a reliable kind that survives. All there is of any in any detail about his life is what appeared in a chronicle entry that St. Jerome added in the late 4th century, I think. I don't have the date in my head. In other words, hundreds of years, centuries after Lucretius died, added to another chronicle. He added an entry about Lucretius. And he said Lucretius was given a love potion by his wife, in consequence of which he went mad, that he composed his great poem in the intervals between fits of insanity, and that he eventually committed suicide. And none of these details seems to me to be trustworthy.
Right, and you do say so.
Right, and I don't. Yeah, I wouldn't give any of them. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about why those details got written down several centuries after Lucretius' death. But that's precisely the kind of thing that I wouldn't want to do, and I wouldn't want my readers to trust.
Well, I actually have kept you for 45 minutes here, and I should.
No, pleasure. I told you I'm not tired of talking about this at all.
It's great.
You can see.
And I would hope that this is. I would really hope that this is the kind of discourse that you talk about when you talk about discourse.
Yes, it's a pleasure to talk to you.
A very Epicurean talk.
Exactly.
So thank you so much.
I hope we encounter each other someday.
So do I. That was Stephen Greenblatt speaking with us about his book, The Swerve, How the World Became Modern. Our talk was what he loved most about Rome when Rome was thriving, which was the idea of discourse in the world, that you didn't argue necessarily, but you spent an afternoon discussing things and then left not having felt that you were the victor in an argument, but simply that you participated in a dialogue in which you learned something, and what might have been your adversary, who holds the opposite position, also learned something. And as we discussed, this would be nice if we could do that today in our world, so we didn't have situations like Syria, and we didn't have situations like Darfur or Rwanda, that people, or pro and anti-abortion, where people don't listen to each other. They hold positions that they refuse to budge on, and because they refuse, then they lose the ability to listen and to gain additional information. And with that, before I go on any further, I thank you for listening to us today. I thank Dr. Stephen Greenblatt for a wonderful discussion. Next week, I can't say who's going to be here because it's classified, but we'll have an excellent guest, and I hope you'll join us then. And I thank you, as always, for joining us here on the Avid Reader, and I thank you for the support that you've provided to us at the Wellington Square Bookshop. As Dr. Greenblatt and I were discussing, it's in bookshops where you can find books that you would not otherwise be looking for, that you find by serendipity, a work that creates a swerve in your life that allows you to perhaps go off in a different direction than you supposed you were going. And that's why I think these stores should stay alive and why books should stay alive. Thanks. See you next week.
You've been listening to the Avid Reader Show with your host, Sam Hankin. Sam will be back next week with reviews and interviews of some of the more interesting books and authors of today.